right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Engagedly Success Lab for the month of March, where we are going to be talking about from appreciation to advantage, building a recognition culture that drives engagement, performance, and business results. If you've joined or been seeing any of our other promotions over the last few months, we've been focusing, we're really all in on rewards and recognition, which is such an important strategy to kick off a new year, making sure that you have a vision, a strategy, and a program in place to make sure your employees can feel valued, feel appreciated throughout the organization. So we kicked off with a Success Lab back in January, where we introduced everyone to a new partner of ours called Switchfly. That is a rewards partner that offers kind of an Expedia type experience for employees, which is pretty darn cool. They can go in and redeem rewards for rental cars, hotels, even local experiences or experiences in cities that they're visiting. Then we went into February, where Dan Guzman, our head of account management, and the team from Gray, Gray, and Gray, a wonderful client of Engagedly's, led a session around how Gray, Gray, Gray launched their rewards and recognition program recently and the successes that they've experienced, some learnings and best practices that they shared out. It was a really great experience for those that were able to attend. And I can link out toward the end of this to the recordings of those first two. But now I am here with Erin Adams, and we are going to talk about putting all of that stuff together, right? You can have a great partner with rewards. You can have a really, sound idea for Employee Appreciation Day or these one-off experiences where you're recognizing employees. But how do we make sure that this is really part of our culture in our organizations? This is something that sticks, and people feel that they can experience in a lot of different ways all year round, and really all through their employee journey and experience within your organization. So Aaron is joining us. He recently started a new role as a VP of professional services for Lever Talent. We've worked with Lever Talent for a number of years, just as we've worked with Aaron. So we were excited to see that partnership come together. And I'm just so happy to have you here with us today, Aaron.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. Yeah, I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to follow Gray, Gray, and Gray. Right, years ago I
Yeah.
worked with Engagedly, and great story. And so, as we think about what my goal is here for us today, now some of my slides are going to be a little context heavy. That's intentional. I want this to be an artifact you can take back with you. I brought a lot of like research and theory in here to build on top of the real practical stuff we get into when we're setting up these rewards programs. This way you can use the deck that I have today at your leisure. Okay, so just keep that in mind. I'll be pausing on these decks, letting you digest it, but don't worry about like taking notes or taking screenshots. You're going to get the deck and you're going to have that as a resource for you, because I intentionally did that to pull things together. Because I start thinking about rewards and recognition, I don't think programs, right? I think system.
Mhm.
So like that's what my goal is here today, to like let's lay out the system, some of these key points. So when we think about the key points, we'll make the business case. So as we're going into conversations and we're thinking about why recognition, we'll get some ROI information that we can always leverage and lean on in the discussion. We'll take a step back and say, okay, what is this framework? So I'll talk about the different moving pieces that we want to be putting together and making sure there's alignment and synergy between. Managers are always important. And I know Engagedly is doing with the frontline leader work that they're doing. That's been a big emphasis for a lot of the maturity of the product and the solutions that they put out and forth. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about leveraging technology. And even Amy's going to talk about some things with Engagedly, just to keep in mind, right? Because there's a nice marriage here between these other components and gets into tech. And then we'll talk about sustainment, give some ideas of like, well, how are we going to know if we're moving in the right direction? I'll give some guidance as we get into that piece. So keep me honest. I'll go through this stuff here today and have some conversations. If you have thoughts and you want to share them in the chat, go ahead. Amy's going to be monitoring the chat. We'll happily have discussions. Again, a little context heavy, but that's for you afterwards, right? So just kind of sit back, take it in, ask your questions. We'll do our best to address the questions along the way, and we'll keep things moving. All right. So the first thing I always like to start with is the gap. The gap is also an opportunity. So if we think about recognition, being more intentionally designed, it can strengthen things like retention, right? And then when we start thinking a little bit broader, it's like, okay, well, it can reinforce performance and improve the employee experience. The problem that comes up is when we think about employees going these long stretches without recognition, uh, what we're seeing here, right? That creates a retention, a performance problem, right? That we know we can address. So when we start thinking about the impact, there's a gap. Many of these organizations, as we see that 65%, they say that recognition matters, but in practice, it's not happening. Right. So you see this from the data. It's still too frequent, too infrequent, it's too generic, it's too disconnected. Right. From we think about the behaviors we want to reward. So that's really what the numbers point to. It's telling that story that leads us to the obvious next question. Okay, well, what is it about recognition that actually makes it effective? And so that's what we'll be tackling in here together today. So when we start thinking about the ROI, I take this in two different ways. They're they're both related. I look at the data, but we'll also look at the theory, like what's underneath the surface. What's the logic that we think about? So one thing that we hear about often is expectancy theory, right? That's one of the main underpinnings of good recognition programs. The idea there is it reminds us that people need to see a clear connection between the effort, performance, and something they value. Right? So we got to make that link with our program in there. The next one, when we think about the reinforcement, right? I'm sorry if that, it's going to get that one screen out of there. Okay. So reinforcement tells us that behaviors that get noticed, acknowledged, they get repeated, right? So we start thinking about, okay, let's reinforce the right behaviors. Here's the catch one. The self-determination theory is going to remind us to be careful, right? If rewards feel too controlling, they can undermine people's intrinsic motivation, like the good stuff, right? The purpose, the altruism, all that stuff that really keeps us going. We want to be very cautious about that. These reward systems, when we start thinking about laying them over really complex and creative work, we can stifle some things there. So we have that backlash from a theoretical standpoint when we think about that self-determination theory. And the last one, we think about organizational justice, right? Fairness matters. Like who's getting recognized, who's getting rewarded. So we want to have data around that. We want to know and make sure that it's building trust and not skepticism in the system. So that's the theory behind it. But what I would actually treat these as when you're designing your systems, use this as design principles. Right? These are really principles to keep in mind that will help you really making sure you're putting together a nice recognition system. So on the one side, we have the theory. Well, what does the data say? So based on the different studies that we've seen, we get a mix of impact. You see this 12 to 22%. So we talk about increasing performance, all of them have an impact. And when we talk about the badges, the rewards, those symbolic awards, we get a pretty decent one. Even better lift when we're giving recognition and feedback. So we're thinking about structured, timely recognition and feedback that really drives the performance. And then the financial. Financial does give a lift for us. We know that. We get some trade-offs with that. But when we combine all of these together, that's where we have the biggest impact. So when we think more systemically, like badging, continuous feedback, financial, it's linking all of those pieces up together to take a more combined approach, which we're seeing even has a greater impact. Right? So the idea here is, okay, let's look at our system. Let's combine these together. And that's what we're going to talk about today too. We're going to talk about combining these together and how we can maybe go about doing that. So these are like, I like to say the business case slides that you can just share with people and say, yeah, this is why I'm doing this thing. I'm going to improve performance, right? Better performance, you're probably going to be more profitable, right? One hopes, I think. So the next piece is when we get into thinking about the framework. And I wouldn't say I'm going to teach you something you've never heard before, but the combination of things that I'm going to show you is unique. It's not nothing like, oh, this is new science, but it is the connection between the different ways to bring your framework together, I think is a little bit unique because I pull from a few different disciplines as I've worked in several. So I kind of borrow from those. So as we get into it, I always like to start at the top, and this is something my organizational design practitioners, I had to give some kudos to them when we start thinking about what role does it play within how the organization actually works. So what you see here is the STAR model. In organizational design, this is like the model they like to think about organizations. Everything's a derivative from strategy that feeds our capabilities, that then is a series of choices and trade-offs that we make between the other pieces like structure, process, people practices, and more importantly, metrics and rewards. So when we start thinking about when we make a decision in one area, what is the implications on another? So in here, you'll see that strategy sets our direction. Structure creates the playing field. Process enables execution. People practices build capability. What we have to understand is, are we rewarding things that drive that strategy that we have, that supports our unique differentiation as a company? Like, is it the right rewards? So before you even get into it, we have to be looking at that. Like, does the rewards that we're about to put out there drive the strategy that we have? So I think this starting point, that lens from an OD perspective on the design side, is a good one to start with. So, yep, go
I was
ahead.
just going to add another point in there, Aaron. As you and I were planning this out, we also talked about how that, that strategy, it's also about driving those behaviors, right?
Mhm.
So are we rewarding the right, not just moments in time, but behaviors that we want to see employees continue to emulate time and time again? So really creating that change and that culture driving piece across the organization.
Absolutely. The behaviors are critical, right? And that's going to send a signal. We reward behaviors. Let's reward the behaviors that drive our strategy. And we'll get into the equation that we can kind of back into that, to your point. But I share this with you because I think this organizational design framework is something, as a lot of talent management, HR practitioners, we don't see all the time. We we just, it's something to just put in our repertoire that I recommend. So start there. Then when you start thinking about, there are multiple levels, right? When we think about how we reward. So when we think about at the enterprise level, it's really about shared sense of purpose, right? And it singles what matters most to the organization. When we're rewarding at that level with a team, it's about, hey, are we reinforcing things like collaboration, ownership, collective accomplishment? And at the individual level, it's, hey, what mattered and somebody noticed it. So I think the idea here isn't that it's any one of these components. It's similar to what we talked about before, and we saw those lines intersecting. They need to reinforce one another, right? And I think that's the idea here is if the enterprise rewards and the teams and the individual should line up nicely, because if they don't, think about the signal and the behavior it's reinforcing that we have in there. So the when we start thinking about types, right? So if we have different levels, let's go into the types we have. So here we're seeing, like we know, we have those very predictable ones, right? That's the formal ones. We have an expectation that we're going to get this award in there. And I think a lot of organizations lean on that. The informal, social, and monetary ones, and that's why I like what Amy was sharing about Switchfly, right? It gives us more avenues to get more creative. And if we go back to the effort that people put in to the performance and to the things they value, if we give them more options, we might get closer to that value point that they're very interested in, and they might just really seek out those rewards. But I think what this slide is telling us a couple things, right? One is that we know that the organizations have an over reliance on the formal and monetary recognition components, but the informal and the social ones are often the most frequent, most immediate, and have some of the biggest impact. So when we think about having that strong recognition strategy, it's always a mix in here that we have. It's never just one of these, even though we tend to lean on one because it's easier, it's more predictable. The others serve a lot of incremental value to the system in there. All right, so this is, Amy had mentioned this very well, right? So this is when we think about the behavior component. So this is actually how you could kind of break it down, right? What do we want to achieve? All right. What does that look like? How are we going to reinforce those behaviors? What do we measure? So when we think about this, that's to Amy's point, like the behavior becomes very point, and we're very intentional up front that this is that behavior that really drives the strategy. And we can look across our organization and think about success and how things work to really get into that. And if we think of an example, here's an example, right? You want to improve customer retention. Okay. What is one of those behaviors? Proactive outreach on the first call. We give badges and then we start measuring the data. So now we can set up the framework in here to actually test what works and what doesn't. I think that's the intentionality behind getting the behavioral information and tying it to the business outcomes. And that's where I think the tools, and even though we're not in the technology yet, in the piece of it, I think it's important to call that out in this conversation. Can we track these behaviors? And I think that's where the power of systems like Engagedly and what Amy and the team work with clients on is these are all indicators, right? You can gamify this experience and put weight towards the things that you think are going to drive your strategy and then see. And I think that's a very cool thing. But I don't want to steal your thunder on that, Amy. If there's anything you want to say about that, I always thought it was pretty cool when how you all did that. So
Yeah, no, I think it's such a powerful piece. And I think we'll talk in a little more detail in a bit, but the ability to measure outside of just an individual's contributions to that, but understanding which teams, which departments, which locations, depending on how your organization is structured, that are really embedded in a rewards and recognition program in your organization, and how is that impacting their business outcomes, right? So I think a lot of companies do a pretty good job at an individual level of saying, oh, that person's so great about giving kudos all the time, that person always gives such positive feedback. But when you can really break it down and see the data around that to say, oh, and that person actually to this point does have the highest customer NPS score. And oh, that department, because the manager is leading by example, they've got, the best performance review scores right now. They have the most people eligible for promotion, right? So it's looking at all of those different metrics that really help to not just promote the team that's doing it well, but those are the stories that you can take and share with others to help build up the program across the organization.
yeah, I love that. And I like the line of sight that you give to people. And it goes back to like our expectancy theory, like one of the theories underneath it, right? People need to be able to see the line of sight between what they do, what gets recognized, and why the behavior matters to the business. I think Gray and Gray, when you guys had talked with them, they did a really good job. And really, I think the easiest one here from a practical standpoint to all of you on the call, think about your behaviors and your culture, right? That's something you can reward very easily that drives strategy because you want to be intentional about your culture. You have some target behaviors already there that you want to reward and recognize, and then you can start to see, the outcomes of having a stronger culture and those things that are there. And I think that's a nice grab that a lot of clients like to do. And and Gray emphasize that too in their last segment.
Yeah.
All right, so I share this maturity model as like this isn't. I'm not saying this is the maturity model you have to follow. What I'm saying is that we want to have a clear understanding of where we're at. And we want to have some objective way to do that. Now that's going to serve us in a few different ways. There's two that I want to call out. One that's a little bit newer as we think about it with the advent of AI, and then one that's just very, right, I would say very obvious, right? The one that's very obvious is growth. Like we want to benchmark where we are today to understand and tell the story of growth when we do it year over year. And I use this a lot with clients because it's pretty simple. But we measure on several different areas where we're getting an idea of those practices that align with initial to all the way up to transformative. The second piece, as we think about AI now, when we have these objective measures that we can implement in a system, if we are leaning on AI a lot, we can train AI to understand that model, and then it can help us kind of guide through it too, right? Because it knows what the different levels will be because it can be taught it because we have an objective measure to do there. So the point is here not about judgment. The point is really to recognize that systems mature over time, that maturity increases, programs tend to become more intentional, more equitable, more connected to strategy, more embedded. So if you're over here on initial, that's okay. You can see a path to move up that transformative area because you can't, jump from initial to transformative. It's probably a hard jump to make, but you have a path, you have a roadmap, and I always like that objectivity and diagnosis phase of anything we get into.
Is that a struggle you see sometimes, Aaron, where people try to go from initial to stage three, four, five without realizing it's going to take time to embed that in and maybe then give up because they tried to take too much too fast?
Yeah, yeah. Would I say it's a struggle for the organization? It can be. Well, I say where you see that struggle, absolutely, is across different leaders because some leaders are extremely ambitious and opportunistic, right? And they're like, "We're here, but we can be there." And yeah, just because you can see it doesn't mean you can will it to get there. I think if we have to be intentional and be honest. And I think that's the thing. So I would say yes. I see them struggle with it, especially when a leader is very passionate about it and they're like, we can get there. And then the practitioners in the background are like, yeah, I, and so, but what this does is it breaks it down. So
Yeah.
then that way, it's a nice way to create a common language with those leaders too that want to be there. You say, well, we can get there. Here's what we need to work through. And they're like, oh, okay. So then when can we be there? Right. And that's what they'll ask you next. And the answer is always yesterday. They want you to be there, but it gives us some objective information to how we can get to where they might want us to be. And I think that's what I like about it. As with any diagnosis, I think it creates a really objective conversation so we can get the personalities out of there, I think, if possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it can also create, it helps you break down the types of campaigns and like individual strategies that you can run to create those long-term changes,
Mhm.
right? Because I know I've seen it before where a company's all in on one event, one idea, they launch it, they go, and they see this great adoption climb and uptick in, how people are utilizing Engagedly or utilizing their program that they're running. But if they don't follow that with a sustainable approach and a sustainable system to continue to drive that, you know, culture really through the organization, it's going to fall back off again. And so they're going to have to find that next, climb that mountain all over again to continue to keep people engaged. And I think that does lead into this next area of empowering managers and how critical they are into driving that sustainable
Yeah.
culture too.
Yeah, I love your segue into change management. Like I kept thinking as you were telling that example, I was like, change management, right? Like
Mhm.
even if they have to climb the mountain and it's like a team climbing the mountain. And if you go up it once and you stop, the next time you try to go up it, there's gonna be less people wanting to go up that mountain with you. So
Yeah,
I
exactly.
think getting in front of that and the managers just play a critical role. And what I really like, I like a lot what Amy shared. And I think as we talk about change management, managers are critical, not necessarily to sell the change from the inception, but the day-to-day activities that happen where people are going to buy in is directly related to that relationship that they have with the manager. So equipping with your managers up front is super important because even though they're not the visionary necessarily selling the change and pushing it across the organization, the change that sustains and lasts and actually does happen a lot of times in that relationship. And we'll see that in the change management research quite often. And I think we need to keep that in mind as we look at our recognition programs we're trying to institute or change, that let's adhere to some good change management principles there, like Amy led us to. So I mean, they're close to day, and we know that as the managers. I think that's why it's important. The problem is managers a lot of times haven't been taught like how to recognize or praise well. So one of the things when we think of that generic like thank you, managers will say, "Hey, I'm giving them feedback, but it's not specific enough," right? When we start thinking about, well, is there specific? Is there a task that we're working on? What action? What behavior? There's different models out there, and what I really like about some of the things Engagely have done over the years related to that is adoption of the SBI framework. And so I think that's a really powerful technique that is baked into some of these feedback channels that serves us really well because it saves us from ourselves of making the feedback about the person and starts creating more objectivity in there. And I think making that like super simple one click. So this is the equipping the manager sides. A lot of times we think about how do the systems, processes, tools that we thought about in the beginning when we're setting up the organization reinforce, right? That ability to reward. So when we think about process, how do those tools support it in there? But managers, critical role. So as we think about this, the SBI framework's really cool. When we think about the SBI framework, generally we see that generic praise. They're like, yeah, keep up the good work, but it's not specific, right? A lot of times it's pretty delayed. And I think timeliness is something we always got to reinforce or measure or look at because how close to that activity or event is super important. And there's no impact shown in that. But when we think about the SBI, now it gets into specific. It's reinforcing that thing to keep doing, and it's linked to the behavior. It's not about the person. So when we start thinking about adopting the SBI framework, I like it because it's simple, right? It's three letters. Yes, star can be used as well, but the SBI is effective. And a lot of the practitioners in the OD space, I know they love it. And the fact that Engagely has baked it in their tool is really good because when we start thinking about how do we frame this, that's a lot of times where managers are like, I just don't know how to do it. Let's bake it into the process, right? If it's important for us to give regular feedback, does our process support it? And that's something you be intentional on the front end so that way they can cover the situation, the behavior they took, and then the impact of that. And that creates some very objective conversations in there.
You
And
know,
again,
this,
yeah, I was gonna
oh,
say,
sorry.
well, to you, I
No,
figured that this one is like, I mean, you guys do this so well. So
we do it really well. And I'll hopefully be able to show everybody a couple of highlights of that in a second. But this area of empowering managers is always something that I am crazy passionate about. I think it's an underserved part of a lot of our organizations, recognizing their need for enablement. And you mentioned earlier about the organizational justice piece as a reason that rewards and recognitions programs can struggle. And I think part of that is if all managers are doing things so completely differently, employees are looking at their peers and other teams and other departments on other shifts and going, man, they're getting stuff all the time. I'm getting nothing, right? So the way Engage Elite has built our program, but also using frameworks like this, you give that manager those tools and you give them that structure to be able to go out and create a sustainable system and approach for them to utilize. And so all employees can feel like they are, part of the program that you're building, and it doesn't, you're not looking to your left and your right going, but what about me?
yeah, yeah, I like that you shared that manager. Like the beautiful thing is like, I'm not even using the system anymore. And then you hear them giving feedback and it follows this SBI framework. And you're like, and that's the beauty, right? They make it their own. It becomes part of their principles and the way they show up as managers. I like, all right, the technology to scale. I mean, that's the key, right? If we're going to do these things and we're going to be intentional about them, how do we scale? Because that is key. And that's where technology really plays a significant role. So when we start thinking about the different levers we have, here we think we want to make easier to give, right? Easier to see, easier to track. We think of things like badges, the peer-to-peer recognition, the redemption options. The key thing to remember though, the platform itself is not the program. It is an enabler, right? The organization, if your organization is unclear about what it wants to reinforce or the managers are not using recognition well, the platform will not solve that. It might show you like who is and who's not, and you might have some of those bright spots emerge, but just keep that in mind. Platforms are enablers. So that's why we want to do that intentional stuff on the front end with our strategy, how rewards, so that really you're finding the platform that can cover those areas that are important to you and enable, right, the rewards that then connect into that strategy that you have in there. So that's one key to think about. The other is, I just can't help sharing psychology with you all. Um, there is, when we think about gamification, so that's some of these platforms can create really nice gamified experiences. And it doesn't mean we have to make it a game. It means we can just reward certain behaviors and people can earn it. We can have leaderboards and those kind of things. So when we think about these levers that we have from like a gamified experience, immediate feedback helps connect action to the acknowledgement in the moment. When it's visible, people get a sense of movement, growth, and accomplishment. The social part of it helps reinforce norms and behaviors that are valued. And so there's that proof out there. So the point is, it's not that it's just fun. It works well when it's applied with these behavior shaping principles that we have here. So the gamified elements that you do should support that recognition strategy that you have. And with that, I think Amy might have some stuff to share about the platform side of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to switch over here to my screen. All right. And now everybody should be taking a peek at the Engagedly platform. And we're specifically in the rewards and recognition module right now, looking at it from an organizational view. And as Aaron was saying, technology can play such a key role in this. Can you run a rewards and recognition program without it? Sure, of course you can. You can definitely put in place ways of providing feedback. But the challenge you're always going to have is being able to tie that back to those business outcomes, really understanding the measurement and the impact that you're having. And again, seeing where it's giving you a lot of positive business outcomes and where you're struggling, and being able to key in on those parts of your organization that you can lean into a little bit more, give them additional training, go in and find out what's getting in the way of being able to put this program in place for their employees. So it really does help to bring all of the systems together to help you understand the true impact you're having on your organization. And one of the things that I love about how our Engagedly platform works is that it's all intertwined. Yes, it's called the rewards and recognition module, but it's tied to every other module in the platform, which means it's tied to basically every activity that an employee is performing across your organization. So whether we're talking about, taking the time to complete their annual performance reviews, engaging and learning through your LXP, to providing feedback regularly to employees or giving someone a shout out through the praise wall. Those are all ways that we can engage through rewards and recognition and help those employees see the value they're bringing and get something in return for being a valued member of your team. So when we look at this, our platform here again, and we're looking at it from the organizational view, you'll see kind of first and foremost, we've got some charts, right? Because we do want you thinking about impact and analytics and understanding what the numbers mean, right? What does the participation in the program really equate to across your organization? One of the things that I love is being able to track things by months. So if you are running specific types of campaigns, if you're coming off of, Employee Appreciation Day and month in March, and you've done a lot of emphasis around that in the organization, you should see your rewards reflect that, right? So you want to understand what are the different levers you're pulling within the organization that are making people embrace this program and really engage within it. You also have the ability to come in and check out your leaderboard so you can recognize which employees are engaging most. Get those best practices from them, right? Understand what's driving their success and being able to look at their business impact then again, right? Because we always want to be able to show that taking this activity within Engagedly, participating in these programs is driving overarching results for your business, but also as individuals, right? I'd love to see that retention is higher for the employees that are receiving recognition and are gaining those points that are happening. As Aaron talked about gamification, I think that's another, powerful point in the platform. And it's not just about within Engagedly, kind of simple actions that are taken, again, like I take the course and I earn points for that. But it's also taking the initiative to recognize people, right? So it's not just being recognized and I'm going to earn points for that. But if I'm out there really trying to acknowledge the good work that's happening, or even give the constructive feedback to an employee about something I feel like they can be doing better within the organization, I can earn points toward that as well. I can earn some of those badges. And if we look, I'm going to go over to my settings tab here and get into our goals so we can break that down a little bit more for you. Engagedly is really customizable when it comes to the rewards programs. So you have a lot of ability to automate parts of this system, but also make sure it speaks back to values. Aaron talked about that in the beginning as well. It's important that this program isn't standalone within your business. It really does need to come back to that overarching organizational wide strategy and the values of your company. So you can create those badges based off of your organization and really make sure that people are being promoted for those um, the values that they're representing and earning points towards those different badges. It all needs to really speak to each other and work together. So as you would go through a training with your solutions consultant or account manager, they're going to help you break this down. What are you trying to achieve as an organization? What are the settings we need to put in place to ensure that employees have the ability to really earn those badges, gain those points, and see that gamification come to life? And if you go over here and you can see if we do the, oh, Aaron, you and I are getting in the way. Might be unable to drive this. So you can see I have that ability to award a badge. I can
Yeah.
very clearly see exactly where those points are going to measure up, which badges those are working towards. And you can control a lot of who has access for this. So organizations can determine if it is just managers that are recognizing their employees. It's kind of a hierarchical design, or it can be everyone.
Mhm.
And it can be everyone with different points allocations as well. So there's so much flexibility and how you can use this platform. And to Aaron's maturity model point, build that up over time, build those additional use cases to where all employees feel like they have that opportunity to grow. The last thing I want to do is just share the feedback that Aaron was talking about earlier with that situation, behavior, and impact. So it's built right into the template within Engagedly. It really does help to structure for employees and for managers how they should be recognizing, providing feedback back to employees, and being really specific. As Aaron said, that is such a critical component. And again, you can determine how many points you want a piece of feedback to earn an employee as part of that kind of gamification approach. And of course, we have our little Marissa AI that's incorporated everywhere within Engagedly that helps to simplify it even more. So if a manager's struggling with the words, wants to make it sound the best that they can go ahead and use Marissa to help them kind of scope out exactly what they want to say and make sure that employee is going to get the full impact of that praise or even that feedback, that critical feedback we're trying to provide. So I think Engagedly is set up in a way that really promotes the concept of rewards and recognition for employees. Again, if you haven't enabled, it's front and center on your homepage. So you'll always see those opportunities to look at how you're earning points, how your badges are coming, and be reminded of getting in there and providing those opportunities to give other people points as well.
Mm. Yeah. I love the customization or tailoring that you guys can do. I mean, I think the badges you create and the language you want to use, you can be very intentional about the way you want to send the message and reinforce the different behaviors in there. So I think that's awesome. What you guys
Yeah,
have.
absolutely. And obviously, we're not going to take up the whole time talking the Engagedly platform during this session. That's not our only goal.
Mhm.
So you can definitely reach out if you are already an Engagedly client to your solutions consultant or account manager, and they will definitely clue you into more there. And if you're not, of course, you can always reach out to our team through our website, and we are happy to give you a demo of how the system works.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I like and I think about piloting, right? Getting those groups testing out, starting to see what utilization looks like, and you have all the data right there. And you joked earlier about they do it one month, they don't do it the next. You'll see what the month you'll be like. Hopefully, it's a nice consistent path, and it's not just these spikes and waves of recognition. But that's it. When you have the data, you can test some of the assumptions of what you think. But outside of data, right, we just make our own assumptions, and yeah, not so.
Absolutely. And I didn't go into the analytics tab, but when you dive deeper into analytics, you can break it down by departments and business units and really even understand which managers are having the biggest impact on their teams through the programs, which again means you can continue to encourage them to keep going. But it helps you understand where you have the opportunity to assist others. And so you're not doing this kind of all or nothing approach across the organization. You can really hone in on the areas that need your support most.
Yeah, well said. Amy made a really good point when she talked about your choice that you have in there. When you think about sustaining, we talked about enabling managers, but we understand that if we think about the way we do work, it's not just that relationship we have with our managers, it's very networked. So when we start thinking about sustainment, and that's where we're moving into this last piece, And we talk about building peer-to-peer recognition. So if we're not there in the beginning and we want to start with managers, sure, but we do want to say, oh, how are we going to sustain this? Think about opening it up beyond, right? So if recognition only depends on managers, it'll always be limited by manager time, consistency, and visibility, right? Peer-to-peer systems, they'll go beyond that, right? And you'll start establishing norms within teams. It makes recognition more frequent, more distributed. We start thinking about putting it into the everyday. We give more access. Now, we always want to keep in mind there are some potential pitfalls that we could run across, right? We always want to keep in mind that self-determination, that highly creative work, complex work, it's genuine, right? We're not trying to control the experience, but we're giving the opportunity. So the goal here is when we think about peer-to-peer, it's about making it easier, removing the barriers to recognition. Like if it is, you have that idea, you saw that thing, do it, right? You want to recognize in the moment that's more impactful, more timely, is going to have more value, right? It's going to drive and reinforce that behavior more specifically. So it is about giving people the opportunity to be close to that situation. When we think about the models that we've been talking about. So I think that's when we get down to enablement that's really important. Uh, and then ultimately, the joint celebrations, the things that they could expect, just making it part of the rituals you guys have in your operating system in there. So just some things to keep in mind. Yeah, Amy went into the data. So we talked about program. We want to think like program behavior. So what specifically to the recognition program or system that we're running? We can look at participation, right? We can look at how equitable is it? Like, are some people getting recognized and rewarded a lot more than others? Why? Timeliness. That's important with feedback, but it's also important to reinforce behaviors. So can we look at that, like how closely to the activities and events? Now, not all systems can do that, and I'm not saying that you can or cannot see that in Engagely, but I think you want to be cognizant of that, right? When you think about the events that you know that there is some time component that you're able to measure, and then making sure there's coverage. So that's access, right? And then our teams do it differently. I think it's a really good data point when some are doing it differently. That's a bright spot, right? We always talk about like fixing what is broken, but there's a whole different lens we can take on that. We can look more appreciatively at it and say, okay, well, what's working right in that group? Okay, let's dive into that. And we talk about being more human centered as a lot of our work's being freed up in some of these tasks. That's a great human centered activity. Go talk to that group. Hey, what are you doing? Like get intimate. And those are things you probably scale across and start to build out across the organization. Then we always think about business outcomes. I put in here like engagement scores. I think that's part of the business mandate these days. A lot of times, we talk about some of the way we have to even report out for some of our companies. Uh, we look at turnover and retention. We look at performance tied to behaviors, right? Are we seeing people who are recognized for these behaviors we're putting value on as better performers? Not saying it has to be part of the performance review, but just ultimately, how are they performing? How are they being rewarded? What's the connection? Is there a connection? And then the correlation between recognition and business KPIs that you have in there. Now, the failures are something to keep in mind. Now, we won't go into each one of these in a lot of detail, but I'm going to call out a couple. The one that's very common, right? Rewarding A, but hoping for B. We see this all the time in systems. You plaster up your value on the side of the board and it says collaboration. And all of a sudden, you go into their systems and you look at how they're rewarding. Oh, we're rewarding based off of forced rankings that we do. Yeah. Okay, we're not necessarily incentivizing the behavior to collaborate that we value with the system that we've put in place to reward people. So we want to be very intentional. And that's why we talked about it in the beginning, because when these two systems don't align, there's friction and people feel that friction. And then that causes misalignment. And if we're misaligned, then we're not effective. And I think that's where we always think about, what do we do as a business? The other piece that Amy said really well when she talked about her example, like, you launch and you forget it. Like it's a one and done, like, hey, recognition goes, but it's not consistent. And so here it's a one-time event, and then people see that like a fad, right? It doesn't feel like a ritual or an operating system and part of embedded into a belief and assumption that they have. It just seems like something that happens in passing. And ultimately, being fair is important. We talked about that with the justice. And then the funny thing is, in the early days in Engagement, I remember clients talking about tax implications. Yes, we do want to be very cognizant of tax implications, and we understand that that is real. And I think that's just knowing you all. So we definitely have called that out for us HR practitioners out there.
I think we've all heard of or lived that experience, right?
Right.
Here's your big reward, and half of it's gone because nobody communicated that to us.
Absolutely. I know it sounded good. It's like, oh, yeah, reward. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, yeah, there's tax implications to this. Yes, we've been in this game a long time. I remember those days. So last thing I would say to do is really just put a plan out there, right? I think the diagnosis piece, when we talked about the maturity, some type of diagnosis, right? That you want to get is where are we at, right? Because it's the what to what, right? What are we doing today? What do we want to get to? There's some change that's going to happen in there from what we're doing today. So really understand where you're at and get clarity around that in some way in your diagnosis. It doesn't necessarily need to be a survey, but it needs to be, you need to have perspective, right? It has to be representative of your organization and what's happening. Next, just design, right? Think about that program, think about the behaviors, think about the setup we talked about. Don't overcomplicate it, right? I think I have a saying that I always share with people. It's like add complexity when it adds incremental value, right? And I think that's good from an implementation standpoint. And then plan in your sustainment activities, your reviews, your celebrations, all that. Learn from it, iterate, right? And then that's where you can take more of a hard systems approach and say, each time, what's the thing we need to iterate on it. Next time around, look at those things. What's the next thing? And I think that progressive mindset where we're iterating, we're adding complexity, when it's adding incremental value, will help keep a nice smooth system, ideally. But you'll find out, right, as you go through it.
All right, we have a question that came in from Jill.
Yeah, let's hear it.
She said, how effective can these programs be if you don't have a budget for rewards? Is it still something organizations should implement, or would you advise against doing that until we have a redemption option?
Yeah. I think it's good even when you don't have a budget for rewards because you can start giving the opportunity and seeing how people use it. And that way you could have no budget, like no monetary value to it. Because if we go back to the types before, monetary is just one of them. You could open up the other aspects. When we talk about the social, the informal, the more timeliness, you just want to make sure you're having the opportunity to reward people when they're doing the things we want to reward. It's not saying we have to use money, right? And it's not saying we need to have some monetary component to it. We just need the capability to recognize the behavior and then we can learn from the system. So I'd still do it. And it'd give me a pretty good understanding of like what are people doing and really leaning into, even when we're not paying them or giving them some kind of reward like that. I think it's a great data. It's a great experiment to even run an organization that can tell you a lot about some of the assumptions you might have in there.
Well, and I don't think everything has to be monetary, right? So I've heard of organizations that will do lunch with the CEO,
Absolutely.
extra vacation time. So there's definitely things you can do outside of having like a real formal budget where you can still have people working towards some type of a reward.
Mhm. Yeah. A- Absolutely. And I think that's what do we want the reward to be? And I think, again, monetary, financials is one of the components. It's just one out of those four major buckets we talked about. So, yeah, I'm with you on that. Absolutely. All right. So, what I'll leave you with, just kind of a recap, behavior shaping system. Think about the system. And that was my intent in the beginning, right? The system. Don't think specifically within the program. Think start broad and then narrow the focus and what it looks like. Because those interconnections that you have and those trade-off decisions and choices you make will help you with sustainability, adoption, but it'll also reinforce, right, your strategy. And that's key. Design across all levels and make sure they speak nicely to each other. If we're rewarding one thing at the enterprise level and something else on the individual level, that's different messages. That's like, the parent telling you one thing, but the brother's telling you another. What do you do? I don't know. It depends on who's around, right? I guess. And that's probably not very helpful. Managers are critical. We talked about this in behavior change. Same applies here to rewards. Like they're the ones that have a significant opportunity to do it first and to really impact and send good signals out to employees. technology platforms like Amy showed us today, Engagely are enablers, right? They enable the strategy that we have around recognition. Um, and be intentional about what you measure, right? Measure those metrics that tie to those things you want to reward, right? And that are important to you. All right. Like I said, a lot of context for you, but this is your deck now. It comes back to you and you can take it back, look at it, send me emails and say, I don't agree with this point. Here's why, after you did a lot of research on it. And I'm willing to learn too. So I thank you for your time, Amy and team. We're around for another few more minutes and happy to answer any more questions. But with that, Amy, I'll toss it back to you.
Yeah, definitely throw your questions back in the chat. I threw one out there. I asked how many people have frontline teams, because that was one thing we didn't dive into when I was going through the platform. Um, and Susie said they do. They have manufacturing employees without computers. We talk about that organizational justice piece. That is a team that gets left behind as well. And we are really excited here at Engagedly to be introducing what we call Engagedly FX, or Frontline Experience, which is an enhancement of our mobile approach, which will include rewards and recognition options, as well as our Engagedly modules, and so much more. There will be a ton more announcements coming on this front down in the future. But I know that that is an area where a lot of organizations can struggle. How do I make sure that my teams on the front lines have the same opportunities to earn the rewards and participate in a program like this as the employees that are sitting in front of their desks?
Mhm.
And I think that's also an important piece when you're designing the framework, is thinking about accessibility, right? And making sure you're not just rewarding activities that are easier for that desk bound team to engage with, but are thinking about ways that you can make sure that those frontline employees have just as much opportunity to participate in an experience like that.
Yeah.
Um, One other thing, if people have questions or examples or ideas on how they've done that, again, throw it into that chat. We'd love to see it. But I realized as I was going through my little demo there, Aaron, that I clicked on the wrong setting. I had goals on the brain. So I want
No
to
worries.
jump back into
No worries.
sharing
No
and
worries.
show you guys all what I was really wanting to show you today,
Well,
which is where you go into managing your badges and points. So please forgive me, everybody. I'm sorry.
hey,
Um,
no worries.
I know it happens to the best of us. But what I wanted to show is that within each of the badges, you can add those activities. So, again, as you're designing your program and you're thinking about goal achievement, and you're adding activities that can earn points based on achieving goals, you want to think about, again, your entire audience within your organization and how you are aligning those points and those opportunities. So, this is really that behavior change piece that we're talking about, right? How can I make sure that the things that I'm allocating points to are actually driving those behaviors that are going to equal organizational wide change or help us to achieve those organizational wide strategies? And in some cases, they can even be department wide, right? Strategies that I want to make sure people are enhancing. So this is what I was really hoping to show you, much more visual too, with all the little icons there. But we've got so many different ways within the system that you really can customize the approach and make sure it speaks to your culture. So this, while it's a change in a program you're introducing, you're not completely changing everything you do, right? You're adapting our rewards and recognition module to the culture you've established and are trying to continue to build within your organization.
Yeah. And we get all nerd out on this part. And when you think about it, right? If all the behaviors are listed and you can incentivize the different behaviors, then you have the data on what behaviors people are actually doing too.
Exactly.
That's back to that when we think about that model that we shared, like strategy, what's the targeted behavior, what's the recognition, what's the outcome. We almost can populate that equation with the data points in there. And I think that's very cool. And I love your FX approach that you guys are doing engagedly with the frontline manager focus, because we know what's happening to a lot of middle management. We know in the workplace, like it's just with the new technologies, but what we're not seeing go is a lot of the front line, right? The individual contributors are still there, regardless of what's happening in some of these other roles. So I think the value of that only increases too. So I'm glad you brought that up, and I know we were talking about it in our prep. So
Yeah.
thank you for sharing that.
And Susie's like, when's it coming? So you're excited. I like
Yeah.
that, Susie. We're jotting down your name to make sure we follow up with you. We're hoping to launch in Q3. So we are in development right now. We'll be doing some testing, beta testing with some of our existing clients, making sure that it speaks to the needs that we're trying to solve for. But we are really excited and hoping to be launching that out in the third quarter of this year.
Mhm. Exciting. Very exciting. Very cool. All right. Any other questions? I got time for maybe one more. Anyway, just curious questions.
You gave them so much, Aaron, that their brains are just absorbing.
They're like, send me the deck, Aaron. Send me it.
Then I'll have questions,
Yeah.
which of course you can have, and you can address those again if you're a current Engagedly client back to your solutions consultant or account manager. You can certainly reach out to me directly. I don't even think I kicked this off by introducing myself today, Aaron. Man, I lead our solutions consultant team. So your solutions consultant are part of my small but mighty team, and we're always happy to jump in there and serve you in any way we can. So please never hesitate to reach out with any questions you have. All right. Well, we thank everybody so much for joining us today. Aaron, of course, it's wonderful as always to share one of these experiences with you. So many good insights that you share with the team. I know my brain's always going after we get off of one of these calls of all the ways that we can help our clients really achieve their strategies within Engagedly. And we're hopeful that everyone here has some really great takeaways to take to your teams and think about how you can start to drive really a culture of rewards and recognition in your organization and not just those one-time moments.
Awesome. Thanks,
All
everybody.
right.
You take
Thanks,
care.
everybody.
Thanks, Amy.
Bye.